Iran did not need to destroy Prince Sultan Air Base to change the meaning of this war. It only needed to prove that it could put one of the most important military nodes in the Gulf inside the frame. That is the real story. Because when a base like Prince Sultan becomes a target, the question is no longer just whether missiles were intercepted. The question becomes far more dangerous. What kind of system produces a moment like this, and what happens when that system starts failing in public? Recent reporting says Saudi Arabia intercepted ballistic missiles launched toward Prince Sultan Air Base, with at least one missile landing in an uninhabited area. Prince Sultan is not a random installation. It is one of the major pillars of the U.S. Saudi security structure in the region, supporting American assets including Patriot batteries and THAAD systems. So when missiles are launched toward that base, this is not background noise. This is a message sent directly at the architecture of deterrence itself. And that message becomes even more serious when you zoom out. Global military spending reached $2.718 trillion in 2024, the highest total ever recorded by SIPRI. Global debt reached a record $348 trillion by the end of 2025. That means the modern world is not just armed to historic levels, it is leveraged to historic levels. More weapons, more commitments, more dependencies, more fragility hidden beneath the appearance of control. So no, this was never just about one missile launch. What you are seeing is a system revealing itself. And once you understand that, the strike near Prince Sultan stops looking like an isolated event and starts looking like the next predictable step in an old pattern. The pattern is simple. First, a power builds order and calls it stability. Then it expands that order until expansion itself becomes a weakness. Then rivals adapt, costs rise, and the old tools stop producing the old results. Then comes the moment the system was supposed to prevent. That is the sequence, the setup, the expansion, the loss of control, the inevitable outcome. And before anyone says this is dramatic language, history says otherwise. Because this exact mechanism has already played out again and again. Look at Britain. At its height, Britain built what looked like a permanent global system. The Royal Navy controlled sea lanes. London sat at the center of finance. Sterling moved through world commerce like blood through an empire. At that stage, the system looked not only strong, but natural. It felt like the normal order of the world. That was stage one. Then came stage two. The empire expanded across more territory, more trade routes, more colonies, more obligations, more flashpoints. From India to Africa to the Middle East, the British state kept adding commitments and convincing itself that scale was the same thing as security. It was not, because every new obligation made the system more impressive on the map and more vulnerable underneath it. Then came stage three, World War I. Britain won the war, but the victory hollowed out the foundations that made British dominance possible in the first place. Debt rose. Strategic strain deepened. The old imperial model became too expensive to maintain at the old level. What looked like victory was actually systemic damage. Then came stage four, retreat, contraction, dependence on the United States. And finally, the humiliation of Suez in 1956, when the world saw clearly what had been true for years. Britain still had symbols of power, but not the same control over outcomes. The visible humiliation came late. The structural decline came first. Now look at Bretton Woods and the American monetary order. The setup was brilliant. The dollar was tied to gold. Allies were tied to a U.S.-led system. America had industrial dominance, military reach, and financial credibility. It looked like a durable architecture built to outlast any rival. Then came expansion. America tried to carry military commitments across the world while funding massive domestic promises at home. More obligations abroad, more demands at home, more dollars circulating globally than the original gold foundation could honestly support. At first, the size of the system hid the contradiction. Then came the crisis. Foreign holders lost confidence. Gold outflows increased. The core promise of the system began to crack. And in 1971, Nixon ended dollar convertibility into gold. That was not a minor adjustment. That was the moment the system admitted it could no longer obey its own founding logic. Then came the outcome. Inflation shocks. Stagflation. A new dollar order backed less by discipline and more by power projection. Oil flows and financial dominance. Again, the same pattern. A strong setup. An overextended expansion. A crisis of control. A harsher new reality. Now look at Versailles. After the First World War, the victorious powers believed they were building peace. They were not building peace. They were freezing instability inside a treaty structure and pretending enforcement could replace legitimacy. That was the setup. Then came expansion of pressure, reparations, humiliation, unstable borders, brittle democracies, a political order that required constant management because it had not actually resolved the underlying conflict. Then came the crisis. The Depression shattered what little social and economic legitimacy the system had left. Institutions weakened. Extremists gained strength. The rules remained on paper, but the material basis for obedience was gone. Then came the outcome: revisionism, militarization, world war. Not because catastrophe appeared from nowhere, but because the architecture had already produced the conditions for catastrophe to rise. 3 cases, different eras, different leaders, different technologies, same machine. That matters because now we apply that machine to the Gulf. The setup was built over decades. The United States created a regional security architecture based on bases, missile defense, intelligence sharing, naval positioning, arms transfers, and strategic guarantees. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE became connected parts of a larger deterrence map. Prince Sultan Air Base became one of the visible hardpoints in that system. The promise was clear: this network creates order, and anyone who tries to challenge it will face overwhelming consequences. Well, that was stage 1. Check. Then came stage 2. Expansion. More missions, more integration, more assumptions, more dependence on fixed military nodes, more confidence that deterrence could substitute for deeper resolution. At the same time, Iran spent years building a very different type of pressure system: missiles, drones, dispersed launch methods, proxies, layered retaliation, and asymmetric cost imposition, designed to exploit the very vulnerabilities that large security architectures create over time. And that is the part many people miss. A giant security architecture does not just project power. It also creates coordinates. It creates visible assets. Visible assets create target lists. The larger and more fixed the system becomes, the more valuable each point becomes in the eyes of an adversary looking for leverage. That is why the targeting of Prince Sultan matters beyond the physical result. It is not only an attack story, it is an exposure story. Then comes stage 3, loss of control. Reuters reported Saudi Arabia warned Iran not to attack its territory and signaled it could retaliate, while still preferring diplomacy. At the same time, Reuters described continued Iranian strikes or attempted strikes on Gulf states, even amid public messaging that Tehran sought limits. That contradiction is exactly what late-stage systems look like. Everyone talks de-escalation, but the structure keeps generating escalation. Public language says restraint. Strategic incentives say pressure. Official statements say sovereignty will be respected. Missiles still fly toward military nodes. That is not random confusion. That is not an accident. That is what a system in crisis looks like. The architecture is still standing, but it is no longer producing clean deterrence. The actors still speak the language of control, but the system is already speaking the language of exposure. And then comes stage 4, the inevitable outcome. A strike toward Prince Sultan. Interceptions? Yes. Limited physical damage? Yes. But a strategic message delivered anyway. Because the real threshold is not destruction. The real threshold is demonstrated targetability. Once a base like this can be regularly imagined inside the retaliation zone, the psychology of the region changes. Insurance pricing changes, market pricing changes, military planning changes, alliance calculations change, and the cost of maintaining order starts rising much faster than the public admits. This is why focusing only on whether the missiles were intercepted misses the bigger point. Interception is tactical. Targetability is strategic. A system can survive one wave. What damages it is repetition, normalization. The moment attacks on bases, ports, oil infrastructure, airports, and partner states become recurring features rather than shocking exceptions, the old assumption of stable containment starts to die. And markets understand this faster than political speeches do. Reuters reported Brent crude moved above $90 amid the regional disruption. That is not a side detail. That is the economic nervous system responding to military stress. A missile event in the Gulf is not just a military event. It is also an oil event, a shipping event, a debt event, an inflation event, and a credibility event. Now, put all of this together. A huge security system was built in the Gulf. Check. That system expanded into a dense web of military assets and political obligations. Check. Its main rival developed methods specifically designed to impose cost on that system without matching it symmetrically. Check. The wider conflict escalated to the point that major Gulf military and infrastructure nodes became targets, or near targets. Check. That means the current moment is not surprising, it is revealing. And that is why the most dangerous sentence in politics always returns right here. This time is different. No, it is not. People will say the technology is better now. They will say integrated missile defense, satellite tracking, AI-assisted systems, cyber capabilities, and precision interceptors make old historical patterns obsolete. But technology does not erase structural overextension. It often intensifies it. Because advanced systems require more coordination, more money, more infrastructure, and more uninterrupted performance. They can delay consequences. They cannot abolish consequences. People will say American power is exceptional. Of course it is exceptional in scale, but scale is not immunity. Britain had exceptional scale. The U.S. post-war monetary order had exceptional scale. Every dominant order believes its reach proves its permanence. Then reality reminds it that reach also multiplies obligations, and obligations multiply stress. People will say the region is too economically important to be allowed to destabilize. That sounds reassuring. It is not. Economic importance does not prevent instability. It raises the price of instability. And when the price rises, the shock transmission becomes even more severe. That is exactly why this matters now. The world is already sitting on record debt. The world is already spending at record military levels. The world is already vulnerable to energy disruptions, feeding inflation and borrowing pressure. That means every new strike lands inside a global system with less shock absorption than it appears to have. So what should the viewer take from this? First, stop treating headlines as isolated moments. A missile near Prince Sultan is not just tonight's news. It is a structural signal. Whenever you hear intercepted, ask what system made the targeting possible. Whenever you hear limited strike, ask whether the limitation is stable or temporary. Whenever you hear diplomatic solution, ask whether the incentives inside the machine still reward diplomacy more than retaliation. Second, understand that modern geopolitical crises spread financially before they are fully acknowledged politically. The missile is one layer. The oil reaction is another. The debt reaction is another. The shipping risk is another. The credibility shift is another. A regional strike today can become an inflation story tomorrow and a policy crisis the day after that. Third, do not be trapped by disbelief. Most people do not get blindsided because the warning signs were hidden. They get blindsided because they expected institutions to keep delivering the results they delivered in an earlier stage of the system. They expected yesterday's deterrence to function tomorrow. They expected the shield to remain psychologically absolute long after it had become strategically contestable. That is the error. And that is the error this moment is exposing. A strike aimed at Prince Sultan Air Base tells you something much larger than whether one location was hit. It tells you the region is moving deeper into the phase where pressure no longer stays local, where fixed assets become liabilities, where deterrence becomes increasingly expensive to maintain, where every actor says it wants limits while every incentive points toward another test. And once a system enters that phase, the burden of proof changes. Skeptics no longer need to prove the structure is under strain. Optimists must explain why a system showing all the classic signs of overextension, adaptation by rivals, widening retaliation, and economic stress transmission should somehow escape the historical logic that trapped every overstretched order before it. It will not escape it. Because the last truth here is the most important one. Breakdown is rarely a single event. It is a process that becomes visible in flashes, a treaty crisis, a currency break, an inflation shock, a strategic humiliation, a missile toward a base once assumed to sit comfortably inside the shield. Each flash tells you the same thing. The machine is not malfunctioning. The machine is revealing itself. So do not ask only whether the strike was intercepted. Ask what it proved. Do not ask only whether leaders want calm. Ask whether the system still rewards calm. Do not ask only whether the headlines will move on. Ask whether the pattern has moved on. Because that is how you stay ahead of what comes next, not by staring at the explosion, but by understanding the structure that made the explosion inevitable. And if you want the next part, watch the next video. Because the real question now is not whether this system is under pressure. The real question is what happens when every actor inside it starts acting like they finally understand that.